The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. Part 3, called The Secret of the Island. Chapter 1. It was now 2 years and a half since the castaways from the balloon had been thrown on Lincoln Island, and during that period there had been no communication between them and their fellow creatures. Once the reporter had attempted to communicate with the inhabited world by confiding to a bird a letter which contained the secret of their situation, but that was a chance on which it was impossible to reckon seriously. Ayrton alone, under the circumstances which have been related, had come to join the little colony. Now, suddenly, on this day, the 17th of October, other men had unexpectedly appeared in sight of the island on that deserted sea. There could be no doubt about it. A vessel was there, but would she pass on, or would she put into port? In a few hours the colonists would definitely know what to expect. Cyrus Harding and Herbert, having immediately called Gideon Spilett, Pencroft, and Neb into the dining-room of Granite House, told them what had happened. Pencroft, seizing the telescope, rapidly swept the horizon, and stopping on the indicated point, that is to say, on that which had made the almost imperceptible spot on the photographic negative, "I'm blessed, but it is really a vessel!" he exclaimed, in a voice which did not express any great amount of satisfaction. "Is she coming here?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Impossible to say anything yet," answered Pencroft, "for her rigging alone is above the horizon, and not a bit of her hull can be seen." "What is to be done?" asked the lad. "Wait," replied Harding. And for a considerable time the settlers remained silent, given up to all the thoughts and the emotions, all the fears, all the hopes, which were aroused by this incident, the most important which had occurred since their arrival in Lincoln Island. Certainly the colonists were not in the situation of castaways abandoned on a sterile islet, constantly contending against a cruel nature for their miserable existence, and incessantly tormented by the longing to return to inhabited countries. Pencroft and Neb especially, who felt themselves at once so happy and so rich, would not have left their island without regret. They were accustomed, besides, to this new life in the midst of the domain which their intelligence had, as it were, civilized. But at any rate this ship brought news from the world, perhaps even from their native land. It was bringing fellow creatures to them, and it might be conceived how deeply their hearts were moved at the sight. From time to time Pencroft took the glass and rested himself at the window. From thence he very attentively examined the vessel, which was at a distance of 20 miles to the east. The colonists had as yet, therefore, no means of signalizing their presence. A flag would not have been perceived, a gun would not have been heard, a fire would not have been visible. However, it was certain that the island, overtopped by Mount Franklin, could not escape the notice of a vessel's lookout. But why was this ship coming there? Was it simple chance which brought it to that part of the Pacific, where the maps mention no land except Tabor Island, which itself was out of the route usually followed by vessels from the Polynesian archipelagos, from New Zealand, and from the American coast? To this question, which each one asked himself, a reply was suddenly made by Herbert. "Can it be the Duncan?" he cried. The Duncan, as has been said, was Lord Glenarvan's yacht, which had left Ayrton on the islet, and which was to return there some day to fetch him. Now the islet was not so far distant from Lincoln Island, but that a vessel, standing for the one, could pass in sight of the other. 150 miles only separated them in longitude, and 70 in latitude. "We must tell Ayrton," said Gideon Spilett, "and send for him immediately. He alone can say if it is the Duncan." This was the opinion of all, and the reporter, going to the telegraphic apparatus which placed the corral in communication with Granite House, sent this telegram, come with all possible speed. In a few minutes the bell sounded. "I am coming," replied Ayrton. Then the settlers continued to watch the vessel. "If it is the Duncan," said Herbert, "Ayrton will recognize her without difficulty, since he sailed on board her for some time." "And if he recognizes her," added Pencroft, "it will agitate him exceedingly." "Yes," answered Cyrus Harding, "but now Ayrton is worthy to return on board the Duncan, and pray heaven that it is indeed Lord Glenarvan's yacht, for I should be suspicious of any other vessel. These are ill-famed seas, and I have always feared a visit from Malay pirates to our island." "We could defend it!" cried Herbert. "No doubt, my boy," answered the engineer, smiling, "but it would be better not to have to defend it." "A useless observation," said Spilett. "Lincoln Island is unknown to navigators, since it is not marked even on the most recent maps. Do you think, Cyrus, that that is a sufficient motive for a ship, finding herself unexpectedly in sight of new land, to try and visit rather than avoid it?" "Certainly," replied Pencroft. "I think so too," added the engineer. "It may even be said that it is the duty of a captain to come and survey any land or island not yet known, and Lincoln Island is in this position." "Well," said Pencroft, "suppose this vessel comes and anchors there a few cable lengths from our island, what shall we do?" This sudden question remained at first without any reply, but Cyrus Harding, after some moments' thought, replied in the calm tone which was usual to him: "What shall we do, my friends? What we ought to do is this: we will communicate with the ship, we will take our passage on board her, and we will leave our island, after having taken possession of it in the name of the United States. Then we will return with any who may wish to follow us to colonize it definitely, and endow the American Republic with a useful station in this part of the Pacific Ocean." "Hurrah!" exclaimed Pencroft. "And that will be no small present which we shall make to our country. The colonization is already almost finished. Names are given to every part of the island. There is a natural port, fresh water, roads, a telegraph, a dockyard, and manufactories, and there will be nothing to be done but to inscribe Lincoln Island on the maps." "But if anyone seizes it in our absence?" observed Gideon Spilett. "Hang it!" cried the sailor, "I would rather remain all alone to guard it, and trust to Pencroft they shouldn't steal it from him, like a watch from the pocket of a swell." For an hour it was impossible to say with any certainty whether the vessel was or was not standing towards Lincoln Island. She was nearer, but in what direction was she sailing? This Pencroft could not determine. However, as the wind was blowing from the northeast, in all probability the vessel was sailing on the starboard tack. Besides, the wind was favorable for bringing her towards the island, and, the sea being calm, she would not be afraid to approach, although the shallows were not marked on the chart. Towards 4 o'clock, an hour after he had been sent for, Ayrton arrived at Granite House. He entered the dining-room, saying, "At your service, gentlemen." Cyrus Harding gave him his hand, as was his custom to do, and leading him to the window, "Ayrton," said he, "we have begged you to come here for an important reason. A ship is in sight of the island." Ayrton at first paled slightly, and for a moment his eyes became dim. Then, leaning out the window, he surveyed the horizon, but could see nothing. "Take this telescope," said Spilett, "and look carefully, Ayrton, for it is possible that this ship may be the Duncan, come to these seas for the purpose of taking you home again." "The Duncan," murmured Ayrton. "Already?" This last word escaped Ayrton's lips as if involuntarily, and his head drooped upon his hands. Did not 12 years' solitude on a desert island appear to him a sufficient expiation? Did not the penitent yet feel himself pardoned, either in his own eyes or in the eyes of others? "No," said he, No, it cannot be the Duncan. Look, Ayrton, then said the engineer, for it is necessary that we should know beforehand what to expect. Ayrton took the glass and pointed it in the direction indicated. During some minutes he examined the horizon without moving, without uttering a word. Then, "It is indeed a vessel," said he, "but I do not think she is the Duncan." "Why do you not think so?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Because the Duncan is a steam yacht, and I cannot perceive any trace of smoke either above or near that vessel." "Perhaps she is simply sailing," observed Pencroft. "The wind is favorable for the direction which she appears to be taking, and she may be anxious to economize her coal, being so far from land." "It is possible that you may be right, Mr. Pencroft," answered Ayrton, "and that the vessel has extinguished her fires. We must wait until she is nearer, and then we shall know what to expect." So saying, Ayrton sat down in a corner of the room and remained silent. The colonists again discussed the strange ship, but Ayrton took no part in the conversation. All were in such a mood that they found it impossible to continue their work. Gideon Spilett and Pencroft were particularly nervous, going, coming, not able to remain still in one place. Herbert felt more curiosity. Neb alone maintained his usual calm manner. Was not his country that where his master was? As to the engineer, he remained plunged in deep thought, and in his heart feared rather than desired the arrival of the ship. In the meanwhile, the vessel was a little nearer the island. With the aid of the glass, it was ascertained that she was a brig, and not one of those Malay proas, which are generally used by the pirates of the Pacific. It was, therefore, reasonable to believe that the engineer's apprehensions would not be justified, and that the presence of this vessel in the vicinity of the island was fraught with no danger. Pencroft, after a minute examination, was able positively to affirm that the vessel was rigged as a brig, and that she was standing obliquely towards the coast, on the starboard tack, under her topsails and topgallant sails. This was confirmed by Ayrton. But by continuing in this direction she must soon disappear behind Claw Cape, as the wind was from the southwest, and to watch her it would be then necessary to ascend the heights of Washington Bay, near Port Balloon, a provoking circumstance, for it was already 5 o'clock in the evening, and the twilight would soon make any observation extremely difficult. "What shall we do when night comes on?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Shall we light a fire, so as to signal our presence on the coast?" This was a serious question, and yet, although the engineer still retained some of his presentiments, it was answered in the affirmative. During the night the ship might disappear and leave forever, and, this ship gone, would another ever return to the waters of Lincoln Island? Who could foresee what the future would then have in store for the colonists? "Yes," said the reporter, "we ought to make known to that vessel, whoever she may be, that the island is inhabited. To neglect the opportunity which is offered to us might be to create everlasting regrets." It was therefore decided that Neb and Pencroft should go to Port Balloon, and that there at nightfall they should light an immense fire, the blaze of which would necessarily attract the attention of the brig. But at the moment when Neb and the sailor were preparing to leave Granite House, the vessel suddenly altered her course, and stood directly for Union Bay. The brig was a good sailor, for she approached rapidly. Neb and Pencroft put off their departure, therefore, and the glass was put into Ayrton's hands, that he might ascertain for certain whether the ship was or was not the Duncan. The Scotch yacht was also rigged as a brig. The question was whether a chimney could be discerned between the two masts of the vessel, which was now at a distance of only 5 miles. The horizon was still very clear. The examination was easy, and Ayrton soon let the glass fall again, saying, "It is not the Duncan. It could not be." Pencroft again brought the brig within the range of the telescope, and could see that she was of between 300 and 400 tons burden, wonderfully narrow, well masted, admirably built, and must be a very rapid sailer. But to what nation did she belong? That was difficult to say. "And yet," added the sailor, "a flag is floating from her peak, but I cannot distinguish the colors of it." "In half an hour we shall be certain about that," answered the reporter. "Besides, it is very evident that the intention of the captain of this ship is to land, and consequently, if not today, tomorrow at the latest, we shall make his acquaintance." "Never mind," said Pencroft. "It is best to know whom we have to deal with, and I shall not be sorry to recognize that fellow's colors." And while thus speaking, the sailor never left the glass. The day began to fade, and with the day the breeze fell also. The brig's ensign hung in folds, and it became more and more difficult to observe it. "It is not the American flag," said Pencroft from time to time, "nor the English, the red of which could be easily seen, nor the French or German colors, nor the white flag of Russia, nor the yellow of Spain. One would say it was all one color. Let's see. In these seas what do we generally meet with? The Chilean flag? But that is tricolor. Brazilian? It is green. Japanese? It is yellow and black, while this—" At that moment the breeze blew out the unknown flag. Ayrton, seizing the telescope which the sailor had put down, put it to his eye, and in a hoarse voice, "The black flag!" he exclaimed. And indeed the somber bunting was floating from the mast of the brig, and they had now good reason for considering her to be a suspicious vessel. Had the engineer then been right in his presentiments? Was this a pirate vessel? Did she scour the Pacific, competing with the Malay proas which still infest it? For what had she come to look at the shores of Lincoln Island? Was it to them an unknown island, ready to become a magazine for stolen cargoes? Had she come to find on the coast a sheltered port for the winter months? Was the settler's honest domain destined to be transformed into an infamous refuge, the headquarters of the piracy of the Pacific? All these ideas instinctively presented themselves to the colonists' imaginations. There was no doubt, besides, of the signification which must be attached to the color of the hoisted flag. It was that of pirates. It was that which the Duncan would have carried, had the convicts succeeded in their criminal design. No time was lost before discussing it. "My friends," said Cyrus Harding, "perhaps this vessel only wishes to survey the coast of the island. Perhaps her crew will not land. There is a chance of it. However that may be, we ought to do everything we can to hide our presence here. The windmill on Prospect Heights is too easily seen. Let Ayrton and Neb go and take down the sails. We must also conceal the windows of Granite House with thick branches. All the fires must be extinguished, so that nothing may betray the presence of men on the island." "And our vessel?" said Herbert. "Oh," answered Pencroft, "she is sheltered in Port Balloon, and I defy any of those rascals there to find her." The engineer's orders were immediately executed. Neb and Ayrton ascended the plateau, and took the necessary precautions to conceal any indication of a settlement. While they were thus occupied, their companions went to the border of Jacamar Wood, and brought back a large quantity of branches and creepers, which would at some distance appear as natural foliage, and thus disguise the windows in the granite cliff. At the same time the ammunition and guns were placed ready so to be at hand in case of an unexpected attack. When all these precautions had been taken, "My friends," said Harding, and his voice betrayed some emotion, "if the wretches endeavor to seize Lincoln Island, we shall defend it, shall we not?" "Yes, Cyrus," replied the reporter, "and if necessary we will die to defend it." The engineer extended his hand to his companions, who pressed it warmly. Ayrton remained in his corner, not joining the colonists. Perhaps he, the former convict, still felt himself unworthy to do so. Cyrus Harding understood what was passing in Ayrton's mind, and going to him, "And you, Ayrton," he asked, "what will you do?" "My duty," answered Ayrton. He then took up his station near the window and gazed through the foliage. It was now 7:30. The sun had disappeared 20 minutes ago behind Granite House. Consequently, the eastern horizon was becoming obscured. In the meanwhile, the brig continued to advance towards Union Bay. She was now not more than 2 miles off, and exactly opposite the plateau of Prospect Heights, for after having tacked off Claw Cape, she had drifted towards the north in the current of the rising tide. One might have said that at this distance she had already entered the vast bay, for a straight line drawn from Claw Cape to Cape Mandible would have rested on her starboard quarter. Was the brig about to penetrate far into the bay? That was the first question. When once in the bay, would she anchor there? That was the second. Would she not content herself with only surveying the coast, and stand out to sea again without landing her crew? They would know this in an hour. The colonists could do nothing but wait. Cyrus Harding had not seen the suspected vessel hoist the black flag without deep anxiety. Was it not a direct menace against the work which he and his companions had till then conducted so successfully? Had these pirates, for the sailors of the brig could be nothing else, already visited the island, since on approaching it they had hoisted their colors? Had they formally invaded it, so that certain unaccountable peculiarities might be explained in this way? Did there exist in the as yet unexplored parts some accomplice ready to enter into communication with them? To all these questions which he mentally asked himself, Harding knew not what to reply, but he felt that the safety of the colony could not but be seriously threatened by the arrival of the brig. However, he and his companions were determined to fight to the last gasp. It would have been very important to know if the pirates were numerous and better armed than the colonists. But how was this information to be obtained? Night fell. The new moon had disappeared. Profound darkness enveloped the island and the sea. No light could pierce through the heavy piles of clouds on the horizon. The wind had died away completely with the twilight. Not a leaf rustled on the trees, not a ripple murmured on the shore. Nothing could be seen of the ship, all her lights being extinguished, and if she was still in sight of the island, her whereabouts could not be discovered. "Well, who knows?" said Pencroft. "Perhaps that cursed craft will stand off during the night, and we shall see nothing of her at daybreak." As if in reply to the sailor's observation, a bright light flashed in the darkness, and a cannon shot was heard. The vessel was still there and had guns on board. 6 seconds elapsed between the flash and the report. Therefore the brig was about 1.25 miles from the coast. At the same time the chains were heard rattling through the hawse holes. The vessel had just anchored in sight of Granite House. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. Part 3, Chapter 2. There was no longer any doubt as to the pirates' intentions. They had dropped anchor at a short distance from the island, and it was evident that the next day, by means of their boats, they purposed to land on the beach. Cyrus Harding and his companions were ready to act, but, determined though they must not forget to be prudent. Perhaps their presence might still be concealed in the event of the pirates contenting themselves with landing on the shore, without examining the interior of the island. It might be, indeed, that their only intention was to obtain fresh water from the Mersey, and it was not impossible that the bridge, thrown across 1.5 miles from the mouth, and the manufactory at the Chimneys, might escape their notice. But why was that flag hoisted at the brig's peak? What was that shot fired for? Pure bravado, doubtless, unless it was a sign of the act of taking possession. Harding knew now that the vessel was well armed. And what had the colonists of Lincoln Island to reply to the pirates' guns? A few muskets only. "However," observed Cyrus Harding, "here we are in an impregnable position. The enemy cannot discover the mouth of the outlet, now that it is hidden under reeds and grass, and consequently it would be impossible for them to penetrate into Granite House." "But our plantations, our poultry yard, our corral, everything!" exclaimed Pencroft, stamping his foot. "They may spoil everything, destroy everything in a few hours." "Everything, Pencroft," answered Harding, "and we have no means of preventing them." "Are they numerous? That is the question," said the reporter. "If they are not more than a dozen, we shall be able to stop them. But 40, 50, more perhaps." "Captain Harding," then said Ayrton, advancing towards the engineer, "will you give me leave?" "For what, my friend?" "To go to that vessel to find out the strength of her crew." "But, Ayrton," answered the engineer, hesitating, "you will risk your life." "Why not, sir?" "That is more than your duty." "I have more than my duty to do," replied Ayrton. "Will you go to the ship in the boat?" asked Gideon Spilett. "No, sir, but I will swim. A boat would be seen where a man may glide between wind and water." "Do you know that the brig is 1.25 miles from the shore?" said Herbert. "I am a good swimmer, Mr. Herbert." "I tell you it is risking your life," said the engineer. "That is no matter," answered Ayrton. "Captain Harding, I ask this as a favor. Perhaps it will be a means of raising me in my own eyes." "Go, Ayrton," replied the engineer, who felt sure that a refusal would have deeply wounded the former convict, now become an honest man. "I will accompany you," said Pencroft. "You mistrust me," said Ayrton quickly. Then more humbly, "Alas!" "No, no!" exclaimed Harding with animation. "No, Ayrton! Pencroft does not mistrust you. You interpret his words wrongly." "Indeed," returned the sailor, "I only propose to accompany Ayrton as far as the islet. It may be, although it is scarcely possible, that one of these villains has landed, and in that case 2 men will not be too many to hinder him from giving the alarm. I will wait for Ayrton on the islet, and he shall go alone to the vessel, since he has proposed to do so." These things agreed to, Ayrton made preparations for his departure. His plan was bold, but it might succeed, thanks to the darkness of the night. Once arrived at the vessel's side, Ayrton, holding on to the main chains, might reconnoiter the number and perhaps overhear the intentions of the pirates. Ayrton and Pencroft, followed by their companions, descended to the beach. Ayrton undressed and rubbed himself with grease, so as to suffer less from the temperature of the water, which was still cold. He might indeed be obliged to remain in it for several hours. Pencroft and Neb during this time had gone to fetch the boat, moored a few hundred feet higher up on the bank of the Mersey, and by the time they returned, Ayrton was ready to start. A coat was thrown over his shoulders, and the settlers all came round him to press his hand. Ayrton then shoved off with Pencroft in the boat. It was 10:30 in the evening when the 2 adventurers disappeared in the darkness. Their companions returned to wait at the Chimneys. The channel was easily traversed, and the boat touched the opposite shore of the islet. This was not done without precaution, for fear lest the pirates might be roaming about there. But after a careful survey it was evident that the islet was deserted. Ayrton then, followed by Pencroft, crossed it with a rapid step, scaring the birds nestled in the holes in the rocks. Then, without hesitating, he plunged into the sea, and swam noiselessly in the direction of the ship, in which a few lights had recently appeared, showing her exact situation. As to Pencroft, he crouched down in a cleft of the rock, and awaited the return of his companion. In the meanwhile, Ayrton, swimming with a vigorous stroke, glided through the sheet of water without producing the slightest ripple. His head just emerged above it, and his eyes were fixed on the dark hull of the brig, from which the lights were reflected in the water. He thought only of the duty which he had promised to accomplish, and nothing of the danger which he ran, not only on board the ship, but in the sea, often frequented by sharks. The current bore him along, and he rapidly receded from the shore. Half an hour afterwards, Ayrton, without having been either seen or heard, arrived at the ship, and caught hold of the main chains. He took breath then. Hoisting himself up, he managed to reach the extremity of the cutwater. There were drying several pairs of sailors' trousers. He put on a pair. Then, settling himself firmly, he listened. They were not sleeping on board the brig. On the contrary, they were talking, singing, laughing, and these were the sentences, accompanied with oaths, which principally struck Ayrton. "Our brig is a famous acquisition." "She sails well, and merits her name of the Speedy." "She would show all the navy of Norfolk a clean pair of heels." "Hurrah for her captain!" "Hurrah for Bob Harvey!" What Ayrton felt when he overheard this fragment of conversation may be understood when it is known that in this Bob Harvey he recognized one of his old Australian companions, a daring sailor, who had continued his criminal career. Bob Harvey had seized, on the shores of Norfolk Island, this brig, which was loaded with arms, ammunition, utensils, and tools of all sorts, destined for one of the Sandwich Islands. All his gang had gone on board, and pirates after having been convicts, these wretches, more ferocious than the Malays themselves, scoured the Pacific, destroying vessels and massacring their crews. The convicts spoke loudly. They recounted their deeds, drinking deeply at the same time, and this is what Ayrton gathered. The actual crew of the Speedy was composed solely of English prisoners, escaped from Norfolk Island. Here it may be well to explain what this island was. In 29 degrees 2 minutes south latitude, and 165 degrees 42 minutes east longitude, to the east of Australia, is found a little island, 6 miles in circumference, overlooked by Mount Pitt, which rises to a height of 1,100 feet above the level of the sea. This is Norfolk Island, once the seat of an establishment in which were lodged the most intractable convicts from the English penitentiaries. They numbered 500, under an iron discipline, threatened with terrible punishments, and were guarded by 150 soldiers, and 150 employed under the orders of the governor. It would be difficult to imagine a collection of greater ruffians. Sometimes, although very rarely, notwithstanding the extreme surveillance of which they were the object, many managed to escape, and seizing vessels which they surprised, they infested the Polynesian archipelagos. Thus had Bob Harvey and his companions done. Thus had Ayrton formerly wished to do. Bob Harvey had seized the brig Speedy, anchored in sight of Norfolk Island. The crew had been massacred, and for a year this ship had scoured the Pacific, under the command of Harvey, now a pirate and well known to Ayrton. The convicts were, for the most part, assembled under the poop, but a few, stretched on the deck, were talking loudly. The conversations still continued amid shouts and libations. Ayrton learned that chance alone had brought the Speedy in sight of Lincoln Island. Bob Harvey had never yet set foot on it, but, as Cyrus Harding had conjectured, finding this unknown land in his course, its position being marked on no chart, he had formed the project of visiting it, and, if he found it suitable, of making it the brig's headquarters. As to the black flag hoisted at the Speedy's peak, and the gun which had been fired, in imitation of men of war when they lower their colors, it was pure piratical bravado. It was in no way a signal, and no communication yet existed between the convicts and Lincoln Island. The settlers' domain was now menaced with terrible danger. Evidently the island, with its water, its harbor, its resources of all kinds so increased in value by the colonists, and the concealment afforded by Granite House, could not but be convenient for the convicts. In their hands it would become an excellent place of refuge, and, being unknown, it would assure them, for a long time perhaps, impunity and security. Evidently, also, the lives of the settlers would not be respected, and Bob Harvey and his accomplices' first care would be to massacre them without mercy. Harding and his companions had, therefore, not even the choice of flying and hiding themselves in the island, since the convicts intended to reside there, and since, in the event of the Speedy departing on an expedition, it was probable that some of the crew would remain on shore, so as to settle themselves there. Therefore it would be necessary to fight, to destroy every one of these scoundrels, unworthy of pity, and against whom any means would be right. So thought Ayrton, and he well knew that Cyrus Harding would be of his way of thinking. But was resistance, and in the last place victory, possible? That would depend on the equipment of the brig, and the number of men which she carried. This Ayrton resolved to learn at any cost, and as an hour after his arrival the vociferations had begun to die away, and as a large number of the convicts were already buried in a drunken sleep, Ayrton did not hesitate to venture onto the Speedy's deck, which the extinguished lanterns now left in total darkness. He hoisted himself onto the cutwater, and by the bowsprit arrived at the forecastle. Then, gliding among the convicts stretched here and there, he made the round of the ship, and found that the Speedy carried 4 guns, which would throw shot of from 8 to 10 pounds in weight. He found also, on touching them, that these guns were breech-loaders. They were therefore of modern make, easily used, and of terrible effect. As to the men lying on the deck, they were about 10 in number, but it was to be supposed that more were sleeping down below. Besides, by listening to them, Ayrton had understood that there were 50 on board. That was a large number for the 6 settlers of Lincoln Island to contend with. But now, thanks to Ayrton's devotion, Cyrus Harding would not be surprised. He would know the strength of his adversaries, and would make his arrangements accordingly. There was nothing more for Ayrton to do but to return, and render to his companions an account of the mission with which he had charged himself, and he prepared to regain the bows of the brig so that he might let himself down into the water. But to this man, whose wish was, as he had said, to do more than his duty, there came an heroic thought. This was to sacrifice his own life, but save the island and the colonists. Cyrus Harding evidently could not resist 50 ruffians, all well armed, who, either by penetrating by main force into Granite House, or by starving out the besieged, could obtain from them what they wanted. And then he thought of his preservers, those who had made him again a man, and an honest man, those to whom he owed all, murdered without pity, their works destroyed, their island turned into a pirate's den. He said to himself that he, Ayrton, was the principal cause of so many disasters, since his old companion, Bob Harvey, had but realized his own plans, and a feeling of horror took possession of him. Then he was seized with an irresistible desire to blow up the brig, and with her all whom she had on board. He would perish in the explosion, but he would have done his duty. Ayrton did not hesitate. To reach the powder room, which is always situated in the after part of a vessel, was easy. There would be no want of powder in a vessel which followed such a trade, and a spark would be enough to destroy it in an instant. Ayrton stole carefully along the between-decks, strewn with numerous sleepers, overcome more by drunkenness than sleep. A lantern was lighted at the foot of the mainmast, around which was hung a gun-rack furnished with weapons of all sorts. Ayrton took a revolver from the rack, and assured himself that it was loaded and primed. Nothing more was needed to accomplish the work of destruction. He then glided towards the stern, so as to arrive under the brig's poop at the powder magazine. It was difficult to proceed along the dimly lighted deck without stumbling over some half-sleeping convict, who retorted by oaths and kicks. Ayrton was therefore more than once obliged to halt, but at last he arrived at the partition dividing the after cabin, and found the door opening into the magazine itself. Ayrton, compelled to force it open, set to work. It was a difficult operation to perform without noise, for he had to break a padlock. But under his vigorous hand the padlock broke, and the door was open. At that moment a hand was laid on Ayrton's shoulder.
"What are you doing here?"
asked a tall man, in a harsh voice, who, standing in the shadow, quickly threw the light of a lantern on Ayrton's face. Ayrton drew back. In the rapid flash of the lantern he had recognized his former accomplice, Bob Harvey, who could not have known him, as he must have thought Ayrton long since dead.
"What are you doing here?"
again said Bob Harvey, seizing Ayrton by the waistband. But Ayrton, without replying, wrenched himself from his grasp, and attempted to rush into the magazine. A shot fired into the midst of the powder casks, and all would be over.
"Help, lads!"
shouted Bob Harvey. At his shout 2 or 3 pirates awoke, jumped up, and, rushing on Ayrton, endeavored to throw him down. He soon extricated himself from their grasp. He fired his revolver, and 2 of the convicts fell, but a blow from a knife which he could not ward off made a gash in his shoulder. Ayrton perceived that he could no longer hope to carry out his project. Bob Harvey had reclosed the door of the powder magazine, and a movement on the deck indicated a general awakening of the pirates. Ayrton must reserve himself to fight at the side of Cyrus Harding. There was nothing for him but flight. But was flight still possible? It was doubtful, yet Ayrton resolved to dare everything in order to rejoin his companions. 4 barrels of the revolver were still undischarged. 2 were fired. 1, aimed at Bob Harvey, did not wound him, or at any rate only slightly, and Ayrton, profiting by the momentary retreat of his adversaries, rushed towards the companion ladder to gain the deck. Passing before the lantern, he smashed it with a blow from the butt of his revolver. A profound darkness ensued, which favored his flight. 2 or 3 pirates, awakened by the noise, were descending the ladder at the same moment. A 5th shot from Ayrton laid one low, and the others drew back, not understanding what was going on. Ayrton was on deck in 2 bounds, and 3 seconds later, having discharged his last barrel in the face of a pirate who was about to seize him by the throat, he leaped over the bulwarks into the sea. Ayrton had not made 6 strokes before shots were splashing around him like hail. What were Pencroft's feelings, sheltered under a rock on the islet? What were those of Harding, the reporter, Herbert, and Neb, crouched in the chimneys when they heard the reports on board the brig? They rushed out on to the beach, and their guns shouldered, they stood ready to repel any attack. They had no doubt about it themselves. Ayrton, surprised by the pirates, had been murdered, and perhaps the wretches would profit by the night to make a descent on the island. Half an hour was passed in terrible anxiety. The firing had ceased, and yet neither Ayrton nor Pencroft had reappeared. Was the islet invaded? Ought they not to fly to the help of Ayrton and Pencroft? But how? The tide being high at that time rendered the channel impassable. The boat was not there. We may imagine the horrible anxiety which took possession of Harding and his companions. At last, towards 12:30, a boat carrying 2 men touched the beach. It was Ayrton, slightly wounded in the shoulder, and Pencroft, safe and sound, whom their friends received with open arms. All immediately took refuge in the chimneys. There Ayrton recounted all that had passed, even to his plan for blowing up the brig, which he had attempted to put into execution. All hands were extended to Ayrton, who did not conceal from them that their situation was serious. The pirates had been alarmed. They knew that Lincoln Island was inhabited. They would land upon it in numbers and well armed. They would respect nothing. Should the settlers fall into their hands, they must expect no mercy.
"Well, we shall know how to die," said the reporter.
"Let us go in and watch," answered the engineer.
"Have we any chance of escape, Captain?"
asked the sailor.
"Yes, Pencroft."
6 against 50. Yes, 6, without counting. Who? asked Pencroft. Cyrus did not reply, but pointed upwards. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne, Part 3, Chapter 3. The night passed without incident. The colonists were on the qui-vive, and did not leave their post at the Chimneys. The pirates, on their side, did not appear to have made any attempt to land. Since the last shots fired at Ayrton, not a report, not even a sound, had betrayed the presence of the brig in the neighborhood of the island. It might have been fancied that she had weighed anchor, thinking that she had to deal with her match, and had left the coast. But it was no such thing, and when day began to dawn, the settlers could see a confused mass through the morning mist. It was the Speedy. "These, my friends," said the engineer, "are the arrangements which appear to me best to make before the fog completely clears away. It hides us from the eyes of the pirates, and we can act without attracting their attention. The most important thing is, that the convicts should believe that the inhabitants of the island are numerous, and consequently capable of resisting them. I therefore propose that we divide into 3 parties, the first of which shall be posted at the Chimneys, the second at the mouth of the Mersey. As to the third, I think it would be best to place it on the islet, so as to prevent, or at all events delay, any attempt at landing. We have the use of 2 rifles and 4 muskets. Each of us will be armed, and as we are amply provided with powder and shot, we need not spare our fire. We have nothing to fear from the muskets, nor even from the guns of the brig. What can they do against these rocks? And as we shall not fire from the windows of Granite House, the pirates will not think of causing irreparable damage by throwing shell against it. What is to be feared is the necessity of meeting hand to hand, since the convicts have numbers on their side. We must therefore try to prevent them from landing, but without discovering ourselves. Therefore, do not economize the ammunition. Fire often, but with a sure aim. We have each 8 or 10 enemies to kill, and they must be killed." Cyrus Harding had clearly represented their situation, although he spoke in the calmest voice, as if it was a question of directing a piece of work and not ordering a battle. His companions approved these arrangements without even uttering a word. There was nothing more to be done but for each to take his place before the fog should be completely dissipated. Neb and Pencroft immediately ascended to Granite House and brought back a sufficient quantity of ammunition. Gideon Spilett and Ayrton, both very good marksmen, were armed with the 2 rifles, which carried nearly a mile. The 4 other muskets were divided among Harding, Neb, Pencroft, and Herbert. The posts were arranged in the following manner. Cyrus Harding and Herbert remained in ambush at the Chimneys, thus commanding the shore to the foot of Granite House. Gideon Spilett and Neb crouched among the rocks at the mouth of the Mersey, from which the drawbridges had been raised, so as to prevent anyone from crossing in a boat or landing on the opposite shore. As to Ayrton and Pencroft, they shoved off in the boat and prepared to cross the channel and to take up 2 separate stations on the islet. In this way, shots being fired from 4 different points at once, the convicts would be led to believe that the island was both largely peopled and strongly defended. In the event of a landing being effected without their having been able to prevent it, and also if they saw that they were on the point of being cut off by the brig's boat, Ayrton and Pencroft were to return in their boat to the shore and proceed towards the threatened spot. Before starting to occupy their posts, the colonists for the last time wrung each other's hands. Pencroft succeeded in controlling himself sufficiently to suppress his emotion when he embraced Herbert, his boy. and then they separated. In a few moments Harding and Herbert on one side, the reporter and Neb on the other, had disappeared behind the rocks, and 5 minutes later Ayrton and Pencroft, having without difficulty crossed the channel, disembarked on the islet and concealed themselves in the clefts of its eastern shore. None of them could have been seen, for they themselves could scarcely distinguish the brig in the fog. It was 6:30 in the morning. Soon the fog began to clear away, and the topmasts of the brig issued from the vapor. For some minutes great masses rolled over the surface of the sea. Then a breeze sprang up, which rapidly dispelled the mists. The Speedy now appeared in full view, with a spring on her cable, her head to the north, presenting her larboard side to the island. Just as Harding had calculated, she was not more than 1.25 miles from the coast. The sinister black flag floated from the peak. The engineer, with his telescope, could see that the 4 guns on board were pointed at the island. They were evidently ready to fire at a moment's notice. In the meanwhile the Speedy remained silent. About 30 pirates could be seen moving on the deck. A few more on the poop, 2 others posted in the shrouds and armed with spy-glasses, were attentively surveying the island. Certainly Bob Harvey and his crew would not be able easily to give an account of what had happened during the night on board the brig. Had this half-naked man, who had forced the door of the powder magazine, and with whom they had struggled, who had 6 times discharged his revolver at them, who had killed 1 and wounded 2 others, escaped their shot? Had he been able to swim to shore? Whence did he come? What had been his object? Had his design really been to blow up the brig, as Bob Harvey had thought? All this must be confused enough to the convicts' minds. But what they could no longer doubt was that the unknown island before which the Speedy had cast anchor was inhabited, and that there was, perhaps, a numerous colony ready to defend it. And yet no one was to be seen, neither on the shore nor on the heights. The beach appeared to be absolutely deserted. At any rate there was no trace of dwellings. Had the inhabitants fled into the interior? Thus probably the pirate captain reasoned, and doubtless, like a prudent man, he wished to reconnoiter the locality before he allowed his men to venture there. During an hour and a half, no indication of attack or landing could be observed on board the brig. Evidently Bob Harvey was hesitating. Even with his strongest telescopes he could not have perceived one of the settlers crouched among the rocks. It was not even probable that his attention had been awakened by the screen of green branches and creepers hiding the windows of Granite House, and showing rather conspicuously on the bare rock. Indeed, how could he imagine that a dwelling was hollowed out at that height in the solid granite? From Claw Cape to the Mandible Capes, in all the extent of Union Bay, there was nothing to lead him to suppose that the island was or could be inhabited. At 8 o'clock, however, the colonists observed a movement on board the Speedy. A boat was lowered, and 7 men jumped into her. They were armed with muskets. 1 took the yoke lines, 4 others the oars, and the 2 others, kneeling in the bows, ready to fire, reconnoitered the island. Their object was no doubt to make an examination, but not to land, for in the latter case they would have come in larger numbers. The pirates from their lookout could have seen that the coast was sheltered by an islet, separated from it by a channel 1/2 mile in width. However, it was soon evident to Cyrus Harding, on observing the direction followed by the boat, that they would not attempt to penetrate into the channel, but would land on the islet. Pencroft and Ayrton, each hidden in a narrow cleft of the rock, saw them coming directly towards them, and waited till they were within range. The boat advanced with extreme caution. The oars only dipped into the water at long intervals. It could now be seen that one of the convicts held a lead line in his hand, and that he wished to fathom the depth of the channel hollowed out by the current of the Mercy. This showed that it was Bob Harvey's intention to bring his brig as near as possible to the coast. About 30 pirates, scattered in the rigging, followed every movement of the boat, and took the bearings of certain landmarks which would allow them to approach without danger. The boat was not more than 2 cables' lengths off the islet when she stopped. The man at the tiller stood up and looked for the best place at which to land. At that moment 2 shots were heard. Smoke curled up from among the rocks of the islet. The man at the helm and the man with the lead line fell backwards into the boat. Ayrton's and Pencroft's balls had struck them both at the same moment. Almost immediately a louder report was heard. A cloud of smoke issued from the brig's side, and a ball, striking the summit of the rock which sheltered Ayrton and Pencroft, made it fly in splinters, but the 2 marksmen remained unhurt. Horrible imprecations burst from the boat, which immediately continued its way. The man who had been at the tiller was replaced by one of his comrades, and the oars were rapidly plunged into the water. However, instead of returning on board as might have been expected, the boat coasted along the islet so as to round its southern point. The pirates pulled vigorously at their oars, that they might get out of range of the bullets. They advanced to within 5 cable lengths of that part of the shore terminated by Flotsam Point, and after having rounded it in a semicircular line, still protected by the brig's guns, they proceeded towards the mouth of the Mersey. Their evident intention was to penetrate into the channel and cut off the colonists posted on the islet in such a way that whatever their number might be, being placed between the fire from the boat and the fire from the brig, they would find themselves in a very disadvantageous position. A quarter of an hour passed while the boat advanced in this direction. Absolute silence, perfect calm reigned in the air and on the water. Pencroft and Ayrton, although they knew they ran the risk of being cut off, had not left their post, both that they did not wish to show themselves as yet to their assailants, and expose themselves to the Speedy's guns, and that they relied on Neb and Gideon Spilett, watching at the mouth of the river, and on Cyrus Harding and Herbert in ambush among the rocks at the Chimneys. 20 minutes after the first shots were fired, the boat was less than 2 cable lengths off the Mersey. As the tide was beginning to rise with its accustomed violence, caused by the narrowness of the straits, the pirates were drawn towards the river, and it was only by dint of hard rowing that they were able to keep in the middle of the channel. But as they were passing within good range of the mouth of the Mersey, 2 balls saluted them, and 2 more of their number were laid in the bottom of the boat. Neb and Spilett had not missed their aim. The brig immediately sent a second ball on the post betrayed by the smoke, but without any other result than that of splintering the rock. The boat now contained only 3 able men. Carried on by the current, it shot through the channel with the rapidity of an arrow, passed before Harding and Herbert, who, not thinking it within range, withheld their fire. Then, rounding the northern point of the islet with the 2 remaining oars, they pulled towards the brig. Hitherto the settlers had nothing to complain of. Their adversaries had certainly had the worst of it. The latter already counted 4 men seriously wounded, if not dead. They, on the contrary, unwounded, had not missed a shot. If the pirates continued to attack them in this way, if they renewed their attempt to land by means of a boat, they could be destroyed one by one. It was now seen how advantageous the engineers' arrangements had been. The pirates would think that they had to deal with numerous and well-armed adversaries, whom they could not easily get the better of. Half an hour passed before the boat, having to pull against the current, could get alongside the Speedy. Frightful cries were heard when they returned on board with the wounded, and 2 or 3 guns were fired, with no results. But now about a dozen other convicts, maddened with rage, and possibly by the effect of the evening's potations, threw themselves into the boat. A second boat was also lowered, in which 8 men took their places, and while the first pulled straight for the islet, to dislodge the colonists from thence, the second maneuvered so as to force the entrance of the Mersey. The situation was evidently becoming very dangerous for Pencroft and Ayrton, and they saw that they must regain the mainland. However, they waited till the first boat was within range,
when 2 well-directed balls threw its crew into disorder. Then Pencroft and Ayrton, abandoning their posts, under fire from the dozen muskets, ran across the islet at full speed, jumped into their boat, crossed the channel at the moment the second boat reached the southern end, and ran to hide themselves in the chimneys. They had scarcely rejoined Cyrus Harding and Herbert before the islet was overrun with pirates in every direction. Almost at the same moment fresh reports resounded from the Mercy station, to which the second boat was rapidly approaching. 2 out of the 8 men who manned her were mortally wounded by Gideon Spilett and Neb, and the boat herself, carried irresistibly on to the reefs, was stove in at the mouth of the Mercy. But the 6 survivors, holding their muskets above their heads to preserve them from contact with the water, managed to land on the right bank of the river. Then, finding they were exposed to the fire of the ambush there, they fled in the direction of Flotsam Point, out of range of the balls. The actual situation was this. On the islet were a dozen convicts, of whom some were no doubt wounded, but who had still a boat at their disposal. On the island were 6, but who could not by any possibility reach Granite House, as they could not cross the river, all the bridges being raised. "Hallo!" exclaimed Pencroft, as he rushed into the chimneys. "Hallo, captain! What do you think of it now?" "I think," answered the engineer, "that the combat will now take a new form, for it cannot be supposed that the convicts will be so foolish as to remain in a position so unfavorable for them." "They won't cross the channel," said the sailor. "Ayrton and Mr. Spilett's rifles are there to prevent them. You know that they carry more than a mile." "No doubt," replied Herbert, "but what can 2 rifles do against the brig's guns?" "Well, the brig isn't in the channel yet, I fancy," said Pencroft. "But suppose she does come there," said Harding. "That's impossible, for she would risk running aground and being lost." "It is possible," said Ayrton. "The convicts might profit by the high tide to enter the channel, with the risk of grounding at low tide, it is true, but then, under the fire from her guns, our posts would be no longer tenable." "Confound them!" exclaimed Pencroft. "It really seems as if the blackguards were preparing to weigh anchor." "Perhaps we should be obliged to take refuge in Granite House," observed Herbert. "We must wait," answered Cyrus Harding. "But Mr. Spilett and Neb?" said Pencroft. "They will know when it is best to rejoin us. Be ready, Ayrton. It is yours and Spilett's rifles which must speak now." It was only too true. The Speedy was beginning to weigh her anchor, and her intention was evidently to approach the islet. The tide would be rising for an hour and a half, and the ebb current being already weakened, it would be easy for the brig to advance. But as to entering the channel, Pencroft, contrary to Ayrton's opinion, could not believe that she would dare to attempt it. In the meanwhile, the pirates who occupied the islet had gradually advanced to the opposite shore, and were now only separated from the mainland by the channel. Being armed with muskets alone, they could do no harm to the settlers, in ambush at the Chimneys and the mouth of the Mercy, but, not knowing the latter to be supplied with long-range rifles, they on their side did not believe themselves to be exposed. Quite uncovered, therefore, they surveyed the islet and examined the shore. Their illusion was of short duration. Ayrton's and Gideon Spilett's rifles then spoke, and no doubt imparted some very disagreeable intelligence to 2 of the convicts, for they fell backwards. Then there was a general helter-skelter. The 10 others, not even stopping to pick up their dead or wounded companions, fled to the other side of the islet, tumbled into the boat which had brought them, and pulled away with all their strength. "8 less!" exclaimed Pencroft. "Really, one would have thought that Mr. Spilett and Ayrton had given the word to fire together." "Gentlemen," said Ayrton as he reloaded his gun, "this is becoming more serious. The brig is making sail." "The anchor is weighed!" exclaimed Pencroft. "Yes, and she is already moving." In fact, they could distinctly hear the creaking of the windlass. The Speedy was at first held by her anchor, Then, when that had been raised, she began to drift towards the shore. The wind was blowing from the sea, the jib and the fore topsail were hoisted, and the vessel gradually approached the island. From the two posts of the Mersey and the Chimneys they watched her without giving a sign of life, but not without some emotion. What could be more terrible for the colonists than to be exposed, at a short distance, to the brig's guns, without being able to reply with any effect? How could they then prevent the pirates from landing? Cyrus Harding felt this strongly, and he asked himself what it would be possible to do. Before long he would be called upon for his determination, but what was it to be? To shut themselves up in Granite House, to be besieged there, to remain there for weeks, for months even, since they had an abundance of provisions? So far good, but after that? The pirates would not the less be masters of the island, which they would ravage at their pleasure, and in time they would end by having their revenge on the prisoners in Granite House. However, one chance yet remained. It was that Bob Harvey, after all, would not venture his ship into the channel, and that he would keep outside the islet. He would be still separated from the coast by half a mile, and at that distance his shot could not be very destructive. "Never!" repeated Pencroft. "Bob Harvey will never, if he is a good seaman, enter that channel. He knows well that it would risk the brig, if the sea got up ever so little, and what would become of him without his vessel?" In the meanwhile the brig approached the islet, and it could be seen that she was endeavoring to make the lower end. The breeze was light, and as the current had then lost much of its force, Bob Harvey had absolute command over his vessel. The route previously followed by the boats had allowed her to reconnoiter the channel, and she boldly entered it. The pirate's design was now only too evident. He wished to bring her broadside to bear on the Chimneys, and from there to reply with shell and ball to the shot which had till then decimated her crew. Soon the Speedy reached the point of the islet. She rounded it with ease. The mainsail was braced up, and the brig, hugging the wind, stood across the mouth of the Mersey. "The scoundrels, they are coming!" said Pencroft. At that moment Cyrus Harding, Ayrton, the sailor, and Herbert were rejoined by Neb and Gideon Spilett. The reporter and his companion had judged it best to abandon the post at the Mersey, from which they could do nothing against the ship, and they had acted wisely. It was better that the colonists should be together at the moment when they were about to engage in a decisive action. Gideon Spilett and Neb had arrived by dodging behind the rocks, though not without attracting a shower of bullets, which had not, however, reached them. "Spilett! Neb!" cried the engineer. "You are not wounded?"
"No," answered the reporter. "A few bruises only from the ricochet. But that cursed brig has entered the channel." "Yes," replied Pencroft, "and in 10 minutes she will have anchored before Granite House." "Have you formed any plans, Cyrus?" asked the reporter. "We must take refuge in Granite House while there is still time, and the convicts cannot see us." "That is my opinion, too," replied Gideon Spilett. "But once shut up—" "We must be guided by circumstances," said the engineer. "Let us be off, then, and make haste," said the reporter. "Would you not wish, Captain, that Ayrton and I should remain here?" asked the sailor. "What would be the use of that, Pencroft?" replied Harding. "No, we will not separate." There was not a moment to be lost. The colonists left the Chimneys. A bend of the cliff prevented them from being seen by those in the brig, but 2 or 3 reports, and the crash of bullets on the rock, told them that the Speedy was at no great distance. To spring into the lift, hoist themselves up to the door of Granite House, where Top and Jup had been shut up since the evening before, to rush into the large room, was the work of a minute only. It was quite time, for the settlers, through the branches, could see the Speedy, surrounded with smoke, gliding up the channel. The firing was incessant, and shot from the 4 guns struck blindly, both on the Mersey post, although it was not occupied,
and on the chimneys. The rocks were splintered, and cheers accompanied each discharge. However, they were hoping that Granite House would be spared, thanks to Harding's precaution of concealing the windows, when a shot, piercing the door, penetrated into the passage. "We are discovered!" exclaimed Pencroft. The colonists had not, perhaps, been seen, but it was certain that Bob Harvey had thought proper to send a ball through the suspected foliage which concealed that part of the cliff. Soon he redoubled his attack, when another ball, having torn away the leafy screen, disclosed a gaping aperture in the granite. The colonists' situation was desperate. Their retreat was discovered. They could not oppose any obstacle to these missiles, nor protect the stone which flew in splinters around them. There was nothing to be done but to take refuge in the upper passage of Granite House, and leave their dwelling to be devastated, when a deep roar was heard, followed by frightful cries. Cyrus Harding and his companion rushed to one of the windows. The brig, irresistibly raised on a sort of water-spout, had just split in two, and in less than 10 seconds she was swallowed up with all her criminal crew. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne, Part 3, Chapter 4. "She is blown up!" cried Herbert. "Yes, blown up, just as if Ayrton had set fire to the powder," returned Pencroft, throwing himself into the lift, together with Neb and the lad. "But what has happened?" asked Gideon Spilett, quite stunned by this unexpected catastrophe. "Oh, this time we shall know," answered the engineer quickly. "What shall we know?" Later. Come, Spilett. The main point is that these pirates have been exterminated." And Cyrus Harding, hurrying away the reporter and Ayrton, joined Pencroft, Neb, and Herbert on the beach. Nothing could be seen of the brig, not even her masts. After having been raised by the waterspout, she had fallen on her side, and had sunk in that position, doubtless in consequence of some enormous leak. But as in that place the channel was not more than 20 feet in depth, it was certain that the sides of the submerged brig would reappear at low water. A few things from the wreck floated on the surface of the water. A raft could be seen consisting of spare spars, coops of poultry with their occupants still living, boxes and barrels, which gradually came to the surface, after having escaped through the hatchways, but no pieces of the wreck appeared, neither planks from the deck nor timber from the hull, which rendered the sudden disappearance of the Speedy perfectly inexplicable. However, the two masts, which had been broken and escaped from the shrouds and stays, came up, and with their sails, some furled and the others spread. But it was not necessary to wait for the tide to bring up these riches, and Ayrton and Pencroft jumped into the boat with the intention of towing the pieces of wreck either to the beach or to the islet. But just as they were shoving off, an observation from Gideon Spilett arrested them. "What about those 6 convicts who disembarked on the right bank of the Mercy?" said he. In fact, it would not do to forget that the 6 men whose boat had gone to pieces on the rocks had landed at Flotsam Point. They looked in that direction. None of the fugitives were visible. It was probable that, having seen their vessel engulfed in the channel, they had fled into the interior of the island. "We will deal with them later," said Harding. "As they are armed, they will still be dangerous, but as it is 6 against 6, the chances are equal. To the most pressing business first." Ayrton and Pencroft pulled vigorously towards the wreck. The sea was calm, and the tide very high, as there had been a new moon but 2 days before. A whole hour at least would elapse before the hull of the brig could emerge from the water of the channel. Ayrton and Pencroft were able to fasten the masts and spars by means of ropes, the ends of which were carried to the beach. There, by the united efforts of the settlers, the pieces of wreck were hauled up. Then the boat picked up all that was floating, coops, barrels, and boxes, which were immediately carried to the chimneys. Several bodies floated also. Among them, Ayrton recognized that of Bob Harvey, which he pointed out to his companion, saying with some emotion, "That is what I have been, Pencroft." "But what you are no longer, brave Ayrton," returned the sailor warmly. It was singular enough that so few bodies floated. Only 5 or 6 were counted, which were already being carried by the current towards the open sea. Very probably the convicts had not had time to escape, and the ship lying over on her side, the greater number of them had remained below. Now the current, by carrying the bodies of these miserable men out to sea, would spare the colonists the sad task of burying them in some corner of their island. For 2 hours Cyrus Harding and his companions were solely occupied in hauling up the spars onto the sand, and then in spreading the sails, which were perfectly uninjured, to dry. They spoke little, for they were absorbed in their work, but what thoughts occupied their minds? The possession of this brig, or rather all that she contained, was a perfect mine of wealth. In fact, a ship is like a little world in miniature, and the stores of the colony would be increased by a large number of useful articles. It would be, on a large scale, equivalent to the chest found at Flotsam Point. And besides, thought Pencroft, why should it be impossible to refloat the brig? If she has only a leak, that may be stopped up. A vessel from 300 to 400 tons, why, she is a regular ship compared to our Bonaventure, and we could go a long distance in her. We could go anywhere we liked. Captain Harding, Ayrton, and I must examine her. She would be well worth the trouble. In fact, if the brig were still fit to navigate, the colonists' chances of returning to their native land were singularly increased. But to decide this important question, it was necessary to wait until the tide was quite low, so that every part of the brig's hull might be examined. When their treasures had been safely conveyed on shore, Harding and his companions agreed to devote some minutes to breakfast. They were almost famished. Fortunately, the larder was not far off, and Neb was noted for being an expeditious cook. They breakfasted, therefore, near the chimneys, and during their repast, as may be supposed, nothing was talked of but the event which had so miraculously saved the colony. "Miraculous is the word," repeated Pencroft, "for it must be acknowledged that those rascals blew up just at the right moment. Granite House was beginning to be uncomfortable as a habitation." "And can you guess, Pencroft," asked the reporter, "how it happened, or what can have occasioned the explosion?" "Oh, Mr. Spilett, nothing is more simple," answered Pencroft. "A convict vessel is not disciplined like a man of war. Convicts are not sailors. Of course the powder magazine was open, and as they were firing incessantly, some careless or clumsy fellow just blew up the vessel." "Captain Harding," said Herbert, "what astonishes me is that the explosion has not produced more effect. The report was not loud, and besides there are so few planks and timbers torn out. It seems as if the ship had rather foundered than blown up." "Does that astonish you, my boy?" asked the engineer. "Yes, captain." "And it astonishes me also, Herbert," replied he. "But when we visit the hull of the brig, we shall no doubt find the explanation of the matter." "Why, captain," said Pencroft, "you don't suppose that the Speedy simply foundered like a ship which is struck on a rock?" "Why not?" observed Neb, "if there are rocks in the channel." "Nonsense, Neb," answered Pencroft. "You did not look at the right moment. An instant before she sank, the brig, as I saw perfectly well, rose on an enormous wave, and fell back on her larboard side. Now, if she had only struck, she would have sunk quietly and gone to the bottom like an honest vessel." "It was just because she was not an honest vessel," returned Neb. "Well, we shall soon see, Pencroft," said the engineer. "We shall soon see," rejoined the sailor. "But I would wager my head there are no rocks in the channel. Look here, captain, to speak candidly, do you mean to say that there is anything marvelous in the occurrence?" Cyrus Harding did not answer.
At any rate, said Gideon Spilett, whether rock or explosion, you will agree, Pencroft, that it occurred just in the nick of time.
Yes, yes, replied the sailor, but that is not the question. I ask Captain Harding if he sees anything supernatural in all this.
I cannot say, Pencroft, said the engineer. That is all the answer I can make. A reply which did not satisfy Pencroft at all. He stuck to an explosion and did not wish to give it up. He would never consent to admit that in that channel, with its fine sandy bed, just like the beach, which he had often crossed at low water, there could be an unknown rock. And besides, at the time the brig foundered, it was high water, that is to say, there was enough water to carry the vessel clear over any rocks which would not be uncovered at low tide. Therefore, there could not have been a collision. Therefore, the vessel had not struck. So she had blown up. And it must be confessed that the sailor's arguments were reasonable. Towards 1:30, the colonists embarked in the boat to visit the wreck. It was to be regretted that the brig's 2 boats had not been saved, but one, as has been said, had gone to pieces at the mouth of the Mersey, and was absolutely useless. The other had disappeared when the brig went down, and had not again been seen, having doubtless been crushed. The hull of the Speedy was just beginning to issue from the water. The brig was lying right over on her side, for her masts being broken, pressed down by the weight of the ballast displaced by the shock, the keel was visible along her whole length. She had been regularly turned over by the inexplicable but frightful submarine action, which had been at the same time manifested by an enormous waterspout. The settlers rowed round the hull, and in proportion as the tide went down, they could ascertain, if not the cause which had occasioned the catastrophe, at least the effect produced. Towards the bows, on both sides of the keel, 7 or 8 feet from the beginning of the stem, the sides of the brig were frightfully torn. Over a length of at least 20 feet there opened 2 large leaks, which would be impossible to stop up. Not only had the copper sheathing and the planks disappeared, reduced no doubt to powder, but also the ribs, the iron bolts, and tree nails which united them. From the entire length of the hull to the stern the false keel had been separated with an unaccountable violence, and the keel itself, torn from the carline in several places, was split in all its length. "I've a notion," exclaimed Pencroft, "that this vessel will be difficult to get afloat again." "It will be impossible," said Ayrton. "At any rate," observed Gideon Spilett to the sailor, "the explosion, if there has been one, has produced singular effects. It has split the lower part of the hull, instead of blowing up the deck and topsides. These great rents appear rather to have been made by a rock than by the explosion of a powder magazine." "There is not a rock in the channel," answered the sailor. "I will admit anything you like, except the rock." "Let us try to penetrate into the interior of the brig," said the engineer. "Perhaps we shall then know what to think of the cause of her destruction." This was the best thing to be done, and it was agreed, besides, to take an inventory of all the treasures on board, and to arrange for their preservation. Access to the interior of the brig was now easy. The tide was still going down, and the deck was practicable. The ballast, composed of heavy masses of iron, had broken through in several places. The noise of the sea could be heard as it rushed out at the holes in the hull. Cyrus Harding and his companions, hatchets in hand, advanced along the shattered deck. Cases of all sorts encumbered it, and, as they had been but a very short time in the water, their contents were perhaps uninjured. They then busied themselves in placing all this cargo in safety. The water would not return for several hours, and these hours must be employed in the most profitable way. Ayrton and Pencroft had, at the entrance made in the hull, discovered tackle,
which would serve to hoist up the barrels and chests. The boat received them and transported them to the shore. They took the articles as they came, intending to sort them afterwards. At any rate, the settlers saw at once, with extreme satisfaction, that the brig possessed a very varied cargo, an assortment of all sorts of articles, utensils, manufactured goods, and tools, such as the ships which make the great coasting trade of Polynesia are usually laden with. It was probable that they would find a little of everything, and they agreed that it was exactly what was necessary for the colony of Lincoln Island. However, and Cyrus Harding observed it in silent astonishment, not only, as has been said, had the hull of the brig enormously suffered from the shock, whatever it was, that had occasioned the catastrophe, but the interior arrangements had been destroyed, especially towards the bows. Partitions and stanchions were smashed, as if some tremendous shell had burst in the interior of the brig. The colonists could easily go fore and aft, after having removed the cases as they were extricated. They were not heavy bales, which would have been difficult to remove, but simple packages, of which the stowage, besides, was no longer recognizable. The colonists then reached the stern of the brig, the part formerly surmounted by the poop. It was there that, following Ayrton's directions, they must look for the powder magazine. Cyrus Harding thought that it had not exploded, that it was possible some barrels might be saved, and that the powder, which is usually enclosed in metal coverings, might not have suffered from contact with the water. This, in fact, was just what had happened. They extricated from among a large number of shot 20 barrels, the insides of which were lined with copper. Pencroft was convinced, by the evidence of his own eyes, that the destruction of the Speedy could not be attributed to an explosion. That part of the hull in which the magazine was situated was, moreover, that which had suffered least. "It may be so," said the obstinate sailor, "but as to a rock, there is not one in the channel." "Then how did it happen?" asked Herbert. "I don't know," answered Pencroft. "Captain Harding doesn't know, and nobody knows, or ever will know." Several hours had passed during these researches, and the tide began to flow. Work must be suspended for the present. There was no fear of the brig being carried away by the sea, for she was already fixed as firmly as if moored by her anchors. They could, therefore, without inconvenience, wait until the next day to resume operations. But as to the vessel herself, she was doomed, and it would be best to hasten to save the remains of her hull, as she would not be long in disappearing in the quicksands of the channel. It was now 5 o'clock in the evening. It had been a hard day's work for the men. They ate with good appetite, and, notwithstanding their fatigue, they could not resist, after dinner, their desire of inspecting the cases which composed the cargo of the Speedy. Most of them contained clothes, which, as may be believed, were well received. There was enough to clothe a whole colony, linen for everyone's use, shoes for everyone's feet. "We are too rich!" exclaimed Pencroft. "But what are we going to do with all this?" And every moment burst forth the hurrahs of the delighted sailor when he caught sight of the barrels of gunpowder, firearms, and sidearms, balls of cotton, implements of husbandry, carpenters', joiners', and blacksmiths' tools, and boxes of all kinds of seeds, not in the least injured by their short sojourn in the water. Ah, 2 years before, how these things would have been prized! And now, even though the industrious colonists had provided themselves with tools, these treasures would find their use. There was no want of space in the storerooms of Granite House, but that daytime would not allow them to stow away the whole. It would not do also to forget that the 6 survivors of the Speedy's crew had landed on the island, for they were in all probability scoundrels of the deepest dye, and it was necessary that the colonists should be on their guard against them. Although the bridges over the Mersey were raised, the convicts would not be stopped by a river or a stream, and rendered desperate, these wretches would be capable of anything. They would see later what plan it would be best to follow, but in the meantime it was necessary to mount guard over cases and packages heaped up near the chimneys, and thus the settlers employed themselves in turn during the night. The morning came, however, without the convicts having attempted any attack. Master Jup and Top, on guard at the foot of Granite House, would have quickly given the alarm. The 3 following days, the 19th, 20th, and 21st of October, were employed in saving everything of value, or of any use whatever, either from the cargo or rigging of the brig. At low tide they overhauled the hold. At high tide they stowed away the rescued articles. A great part of the copper sheathing had been torn from the hull, which every day sank lower. But before the sand had swallowed the heavy things which had fallen through the bottom, Ayrton and Pencroft, diving to the bed of the channel, recovered the chains and anchors of the brig, the iron of her ballast, and even 4 guns, which, floated by means of empty casks, were brought to shore. It may be seen that the arsenal of the colony had gained by the wreck, as well as the storerooms of Granite House. Pencroft, always enthusiastic in his projects, already spoke of constructing a battery to command the channel and the mouth of the river. With 4 guns he engaged to prevent any fleet, however powerful it might be, from venturing into the waters of Lincoln Island. In the meantime, when nothing remained of the brig but a useless hulk, bad weather came on, which soon finished her. Cyrus Harding had intended to blow her up, so as to collect the remains on the shore, but a strong gale from the northeast and a heavy sea compelled him to economize his powder. In fact, on the night of the 23rd, the hull entirely broke up, and some of the wreck was cast up on the beach. As to the papers on board, it is useless to say that, although he carefully searched the lockers of the poop, Harding did not discover any trace of them. The pirates had evidently destroyed everything that concerned either the captain or the owners of the Speedy, and as the name of her port was not painted on her counter, there was nothing which would tell them her nationality. However, by the shape of her boats, Ayrton and Pencroft believed that the brig was of English build. A week after the catastrophe, or rather after the fortunate, though inexplicable, event to which the colony owed its preservation, nothing more could be seen of the vessel, even at low tide. The wreck had disappeared, and Granite House was enriched by nearly all it had contained. However, the mystery which enveloped its strange destruction would doubtless never have been cleared away if, on the 30th of November, Neb, strolling on the beach, had not found a piece of a thick iron cylinder bearing traces of explosion. The edges of this cylinder were twisted and broken, as if they had been subjected to the action of some explosive substance. Neb brought this piece of metal to his master, who was then occupied with his companions in the workshop of the Chimneys. Cyrus Harding examined the cylinder attentively, then, turning to Pencroft, "You persist, my friend," said he, "in maintaining that the Speedy was not lost in consequence of a collision?" "Yes, captain," answered the sailor. "You know as well as I do that there are no rocks in the channel." "But suppose she had run against this piece of iron," said the engineer, showing the broken cylinder. "Why, that bit of pipe!" exclaimed Pencroft in a tone of perfect incredulity. "My friends," resumed Harding, "you remember that before she foundered, the brig rose on the summit of a regular waterspout." "Yes, captain," replied Herbert. "Well, would you like to know what occasioned that waterspout? It was this," said the engineer, holding up the broken tube. "That?" returned Pencroft. "Yes. This cylinder is all that remains of a torpedo." "A torpedo!" exclaimed the engineer's companions. "And who put the torpedo there?" demanded Pencroft, who did not like to yield. "All that I can tell you is, that it was not I," answered Cyrus Harding. "But it was there, and you have been able to judge of its incomparable power." End of chapter.